Welcome to Diaspora, the show where we share the remarkable stories of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent. I am your host, Aditya Mehta, and each week we sit down with individuals who've made the journey over and share their experiences, challenges, and triumphs. We delve into their unique perspectives on adapting to a new culture while staying connected to their roots. Today, we are joined by Dr. Namit Choksi. He is a doctor, he has a master's in public health from Harvard, and then he also was part of the Schwarzman Scholar program. And then he wanted to keep up with me, so he got his MBA from MIT. I think last week he was hanging out with a very well known and famous person worldwide. We'll go into that a little bit more when we speak. I have known Namit since, well, he was born because he's my second cousin, I'm going to say. You'd much rather just be my brother. It's all the same. We are super close. We've been a big part of each other's lives this whole time, and we both find ourselves on this side of the pond. So, with that, let's dive into this week's conversation. Namit, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Aditya.
It's good to see you. Last I met you was at your wedding in October, so 4 or 5 months in. How's that going?
Well, it's going well. Luckily, my wife's not in the same room. So um,
Yeah, it
I'm
was
learning
it,
to pick up.
it was a fun wedding. We had people from all over the world there, so I really had a blast. And I think all the people who visited India for the first time for your wedding also had a blast. It definitely seemed like that. So,
Yeah, we'll
in
sure. We had about 21 nationalities
oh wow,
as we did at the wedding. So it was a lot of fun.
I got married in 2011, and there was no live streaming back then. So I remember we had spent 100,000 rupees in those days to get a live stream done on Facebook, and about 100 people logged in. So it came out to be 1,000 rupees a plate, which is what we paid for the buffet, anyways. But it's amazing how those things are so much easier now as time has passed. So, Namit, let's start off with your growing up in Bombay and up to the point where you'd finished with your education in India and you first came abroad. And then I'll go into more follow up questions.
Well, so as you obviously know, I was born and raised in Bombay. I would say Ada and I grew up together. I went to medical school right after, was always interested at the intersection of healthcare, policy, business. Come from a family of doctors, so was tipped a little more towards the clinical side. Transitioned out, came to the US after my MBBS, started training in clinical medicine at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, but very early on realized that whilst I enjoyed clinical medicine, it wasn't my ultimate calling. I wanted to think beyond the four walls of the hospital, kind of jumped out, got a degree in public health at Harvard, rightly pointed out. At that time, worked with my mentor, Dr. Thomas Burke at Mass Gen, to develop and launch a small medical device that prevents postpartum hemorrhage or bleeding after childbirth, which is one of the biggest preventable causes of maternal deaths worldwide. Our device only cost about $3 versus Buckrey or any other comparable device that was about $350. We scaled it up. Millions of women across, I would say, 14 different countries have access to the device now. We handed over all the patents for free to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I then continued to do my postdoc in mucosal immunology and genetics at the Mass General Hospital of Harvard Med, again with the focus of reducing the cost of treating reproductive tract infections in women using probiotics. One of the pharma companies is now commercializing that technology. And then, in a twist of fate, I moved to China to do a really fun program called the Schwarzman Scholars, run by Steve Schwarzman, who's the chairman and CEO of Blackstone. Had a fun time, had the chance to learn from the likes of President Obama, John Kerry, Madeleine Albright, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia. They were all fellows in residence. And then jumped to venture capital. I was working for a $5 billion fund, looking at India and emerging economies on the healthcare investment side. COVID hit, so I decided to jump back ship, went back home, was on the front lines with my parents, etc., and also worked with the Minister of Health on India's COVID-19 response and strategy. Learned a lot of lessons, saw spending only 1.3% GDP on healthcare and what could it do. And as things started looking upward, joined Perfect Day, which is a biotech startup in the precision fermentation space. And we can dive into that a little later. But I was serving as the head of strategy and growth for India and Asia Pacific for Perfect Day. So was responsible for our partnerships and M&As, etc. And kind of went to MIT with that and was thinking about kind of stepping down from my role, but I had a lovely boss and a mentor who was like, I wanted to stick around. So then Monday to Thursday, I was in the classroom, and then Thursday to Monday, I would be flying to the other side of the world. Continued doing that for 2 years, just got my MBA from MIT, graduated last year. I was working also part time for another venture capital fund where I serve as an observer on a bunch of boards, again in the healthcare biotech space. Took a quick sabbatical, enjoyed my wedding, and then recently joined a small mid-market private equity fund called Asclepion, where I serve as an operating slash business partner and responsible for turning our acquisitions around. So hope I've encapsulated that well. Back to you.
Very action-packed career. I'm gonna all the way to the back and where you started your story. Both your parents are doctors, and now your sister is on the same path. Was there any pressure ever to be a doctor, or I would be surprised, but I'm asking the question anyways.
Well, so look, no, there was, to answer your question, surprisingly, there was no pressure, except I would say there was a little bit of emotional encouragement from my mom to be a doctor. I wanted to be a musician initially, and my dad was very instrumental in trying to push me onto that side. But I
Yeah,
realized that out of a billion people, maybe there's one A.R. Rahman.
right.
And I didn't want to take that risk. So I was like, next best option, medical school. So let's jump right
Yeah.
there.
I think you had a phase as well where you wanted to go into aviation and become a pilot, if I remember correctly.
That is absolutely correct. And
Yeah,
yes, I wanted to be a pilot. And one of the most instrumental figures who changed that was your mom, who also happens
yeah,
to be my aunt. I remember
yeah,
she offered to write a blank check and she said, whatever you would make as a pilot over the next 5 years, here's the check, but make sure you study and go to medical school. So she's played a very key role in my life. And it's that kind of silent support that has
yeah,
helped me get where I am today. So very, very grateful to her for that.
yeah. That sounds like what my mom would do for sure. Mom, if you're hearing, I'll take that blank check right now. I don't mind.
I'll
when
take
when
that too.
when deciding the path that you were eventually going to follow, how important was impact to community, impact to society, as one of the decision factors for you?
I think if I can be honest, a lot of the decisions that I took initially were not impact focused until I arrived to Harvard. And I think you and I have spoken about this quite a bit, and you've been such a great resource and a sounding board. But when I stepped into Harvard, it really changed my worldviews, right? Like we were here, and then the question was not really about how much money you're going to make or about what are you doing in your career, but was really about what kind of impact can you leave behind. It reminds me of this quote from Robert Frost where it says, life is real, life is earnest, grave is not its ultimate goal, thus thou art, thus thou returnest, wasn't spoken of the soul, which really meant that you're not here to live and die, you're here to be remembered. And I think Harvard played such a key role in pushing you to work towards an impact. And I can share a small story
Yeah,
which kind of helped me shape a little bit of where I am today, but also talks to mindset that institutions like these kind of incur. So I remember that there was an earthquake in Bhuj, Gujarat,
yeah,
and my dad was
2001.
going to serve.
Yeah,
2001, yes, my dad was going to serve with the army. I was about 10 years old at that time, 9 or 10, give or take. So my dad said, what can you do? Right. So I would go out and go sell these little paintings that I had drawn and just try to collect money to put them towards the fundraiser. And I remember that one of the houses that I went to, they opened the door, they gave me 10 rupees, which is like a 10 cent, 15-cent donation, and said, what would you like to do when you grow up? And I said, I would like to change the world. And that auntie looked at me in the eye and she was like, well, guess you're too ambitious to be a young kid. I didn't even know what the word ambitious meant. So I went back home, I asked my mom, and I
yeah,
said, Mom, someone called me very ambitious. I don't know if I thought in the right direction, but I want to know what that word means. And she was like, well, you don't need to know what it means. All I will tell you is you will prove them right and you will prove them wrong, right? Like the world is your oyster. And the
yeah,
mindset change that I refer to is when I came to Harvard for the first time. On our welcome address, the dean said, you're here to change the world and we'll help you support on the how. And so that shift in that mindset really changed the way I looked at my life. And ever since, I haven't looked back, and impact is the most important thing I look for. Even in the current role that I'm in, I gave up a higher paying job because I had the ability to create an impact and work towards mission oriented company. One of the acquisitions that we made is in the mental health care space for physicians. So to answer your question, I think impact forms, I would say, about 70% of the decisions that I make.
Nice. Yeah, for I think I was probably in my late 20s or around my early 30s when that thing became central to whatever I tried to do. Yeah, there's obviously many ways to create an impact. You could innovate, you could create jobs, you could make lives better for people in some way or the other. So it's always been part of my kind of agenda to whatever you do, there's always a way to have a positive impact. So I have a someone I know who is a junk lugger. So they have a company that will come and haul all your junk for you, and they try to donate slash recycle everything that they haul away versus just dumping it. So even if you're a junk lugger, there's a way to create an impact in the world around you, right? So I'm glad that you and I are similar with that. How much was the impact a decision factor when you interned with the Indian Railways? And if you could tell us more about that internship or assignment that you had.
Sure. So my internship at the Indian Railways was really a cold email to our cabinet minister, Mr. Suresh Prabhu. And I said, look, I'm a kid from Harvard. I really want to dive into the world of policy. And I want to choose railways, A, because I don't know if a lot of people know, but the Indian Railways has budgets that are almost at par with the Indian Army. It employs more people than the Indian Army, at
Yeah,
least it did back then. And the Indian railway budget was so big that it used to be presented separately as an item in the
yep,
parliament versus the entire union
yep,
budget. And so I also really looked up to Suresh Prabhu, who was very humble, very down to earth leader and mentor. So it originated from a cold email. I ended up in Delhi, and impact again was a part of it, right? Like one of the things that I really wanted to learn about was the Lifeline Express, which was one of the world's first hospital trains. So it's a train that goes to the most remote villages of India. It's a full-fledged hospital. You know, it has operating rooms, it has admission suites, etc. And it really goes to the remotest villages in the country to deliver healthcare. It was a joint project between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Railways. So I wanted to kind of work on that. But at the same point in time, the Railways was undergoing a massive transition to the public-private partnership model, which, someone who wanted to step in into an investment side of things was a massive learning experience, right? So in
yep,
terms of the impact that we were creating, we were really working towards making that travel more accessible and more comfortable for millions and millions of Indians. So I would say it again, impact was a very, very massive part of it. And again, I found mentorships out of that, which have continued to help me take that impact forward.
yeah. That's amazing. The good thing with working in India or doing business in India is the ability to impact at scale. When I moved to Canada, when I was looking for my first job, people would say, "Hey, have you got any Canada experience?" And I would say, "No, but I've worked on a product which is used by X million people." Like it's the scale and therefore the pace at which you learn, I think, and especially for I
Is
think people who are practicing doctors, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but just the sheer volume of patients you see, the experience you build is much
Oh, of
quicker, right?
course. And I can share, yeah, I can share a fun story there too. Just because you speak of volumes, right? To give you a perspective, the Indian Railways carry about 8 billion passengers every year. So about 22 million passengers per day. That's the population of a small European country that travels and uses the Indian Railways every day. So
Yeah,
really the kind of impact you could create for millions and billions of Indians
yeah,
was just mind-boggling. And you're very right, right? Like in India, when I trained in medical school, so when I moved to the US and I was at Hopkins, I remember, and for people who maybe don't know, Johns Hopkins is one of the top medical schools and hospitals in this country and
yeah,
across the world. So I stepped in, and my mentor was like, "Oh, there's a really heavy OPD today, an outpatient day. We got to make sure the patients are in and out really quick." And I was like, "Oh, sure, Dr. Anderson." I walked out, I stepped back in, was like, we have 18 patients. And she's like, yeah, that's really heavy, don't you think? I was like, oh, on an average day, me as an intern in my medical school would see about 124 to 130 patients every day.
wow,
So just the scale and kind of learnings that you would get, to your
Yeah.
point, was very valued when I was in
Yeah.
India, and that kind of helped me transition out here to the US.
Yeah. Nice. Let's talk about the Schwarzman Scholar Program. How did that come about for you, and what was your motivation for joining it? And then once probably on the other side of the break, we can talk about the actual experience.
Sure. So the Schwarzman Scholars Program, I actually came to know of it through one of my friends from Brazil, Italo, who had attended the G20 Youth Summit with me. So I was the head of state for India for the G20 Youth Summit, which is the youth version of the actual G20 summit that happens. I attended that in St. Petersburg. So I heard about this new program that was launched by Steve Schwarzman, who's the chairman and CEO of Blackstone, which is the world's biggest private equity fund. Again, manages close to $1 trillion in assets now. And for me, it was really motivating because I really wanted to step into China, understand its evolving role in the world, and also really understand how China was able to lift 800 million people out of poverty, provide health insurance to all of them, and in terms of innovation, I think, again, I've loved being in the US and I've loved being on the front end of seeing all these cutting edge technologies. But healthcare in this country is very, very expensive.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to really figure out, was there a way of bridging gaps in healthcare access using low cost innovation and capital reallocation? And that was really my inspiration to jump into China overall. Schwarzman was based out of Tsinghua. The program, to give perspective, was a fully funded scholarship. It's similar to the Rhodes Scholarship, and Steve Schwarzman often jokes that the only difference between Rhodes and Schwarzman is Cecile Rhodes is dead and Steve Schwarzman is still alive.
Right.
But fully funded fellowship, went through a grueling process. We had to submit an application, etc. But we also had the interview, and on my interview, I had, I think, about 8 people. One was David Petraeus, who was the CIA Director General. I had Fareed Zakaria, who was at CNN. I had Kevin Rudd, who was the Prime Minister of Australia. I had Dominic Barton, who was the Chairman and CEO of McKinsey and Company. I had Rob Garris, who was the head of admissions for Schwartzman. And then I had Steve Schwarzman, who was the chairman and CEO of Blackstone. I had the party secretary of Tsinghua University. And I also had the kind lady who was the head of legal for Deloitte Worldwide. So it was really like a panel at the JW Marriott Essex House in New York in 30 minutes, which I often joke it was the best and the worst 30 minutes of my life.
Yeah. That's amazing. So let's take a break here. And when we come back, we will talk to Namit about the Schwarzman program and then his journey onto MIT and then his career after that. So we'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Diaspora on KKNW. We are talking to Namit Choksi, a doctor, a scholar, generally smart guy, and my cousin. So, Namit, when we left off, we were talking about your decision to go to the Schwarzman program. Once you were in, what was that year in China like, and what were some of the highlights of that experience?
Oh man, the year in China was a year like no other. I often joke that I think Schwartzman is 50% of my social life now. So, just to put things into perspective, these are amazing individuals from very different backgrounds. The only common thread that binds them all is their ability to create an impact and make an impact in this world and make it a better place. We were called the precious pandas of Tsinghua, which is the university where I went to, because we lived in a five-star hotel, right? Like our college, we lived upstairs, we came downstairs, we had our own cafeteria, we had our own bar, and it is the only university college in China that has its own bar. The
Mm.
drinks were originally free in the first and the second year, and then people complained that because it was free, a lot of local students would then start dating Schwarzman scholars so they could get invited to the bar. And so they started charging us $1 for a beer.
Why not?
But it was a year like no other. So,
Yeah,
like we had the ability to learn from really amazing people like Kevin Rudd, Steve Schwartzman, former heads of state, different professors. So the learning piece was great, but I think a lot of the learning really happened outside of those classes, right?
sure.
The ability to interact with so many nationalities, right? And to be able to talk to so many people who are so passionate about what they did, it really opened my view. And
Yeah,
then we had the ability to travel to different parts of China. So There were things about China that I did not enjoy, and there are things about China that I really enjoyed, right? The kind of growth that China was able to achieve.
Right.
Again, fun fact, when I was in Chengdu, which is one of my favorite cities in China where the pandas come from, the average time to build a skyscraper from ground up, scratch, was about 18 to 24 months.
Yeah.
Now, that is the amount of time that would take us in India or here in the US to acquire a piece of land and
Or
kind of
get
clear it out.
permits. Permits would
Or
take two
get
years.
permits.
Yeah.
There you go. Yes.
Yeah. With when I was building warehouses for Amazon, that's sometimes how much time it took to entitle the land and get the permit for a
So for
warehouse.
me, that
Yeah.
kind of growth was mind boggling, right? And the
Yeah.
ability to jump into so many different cultures, learn different parts of China. I also started speaking a little bit of Chinese, but I keep joking, what the Zhongwen Bu Tai Hao, which means my Chinese is really bad. But it was a really nice cultural immersion, and I
Yeah.
like no other. All of my best friends or my closest friends, most of them, I would say, not all. A few of them would kill me if I said all, but most of them are from Schwarzman. And as you saw at my wedding, we had like
Yeah.
30 odd Schwarzman scholars come in, and we were a batch of 120. So
Yeah.
really close, really fun year. We were able to dive deeper into China and its evolving role in the world and the geopolitics of it, but from a very, very secure environment of
Yeah.
Schwarzman College. Like we had Wi-Fi, we had access to Facebook, we had access to Google, things that were not available outside. So was a perfect experience that anyone could ask for, and perfect ability to jump into China.
Yeah, and if 30 out of 120 people came, that also speaks to your ability to build relationships. Because I remember our common brother-in-law Rahul and I were following you around in your neighborhood one day. We were walking from the clinic to your home or something, and you probably said hi to like 20 people in that short time, from the shopkeeper to like some random person on the street. And you're like, man, how does Namit maintain all these relationships and stay in touch with so many people and have such great things that everybody says about him? Because it's a full-time job maintaining those relationships. And I know because I started doing that with London Business School. It's you literally have to do it as an intentional thing and set time, but it also speaks to your ability to do that, because not everybody has the energy and perseverance to keep in touch with so many people. So
I appreciate that, man. And I think I get asked this question quite a bit. I've had some really solid mentors who are very, very high ranking individuals, but I've also really had mentors from my high school, right? And my
yeah,
math teacher, Rashmi Dubey, she was crying at my wedding because she's like, oh my God, you still remember me. And I was like, I would have never passed my math class. I was terrible at math. I
yeah,
almost failed. And she would take me up to her house for those extra classes. And I would say, I will only study if you gave me ice cream. So she would also bring chocolate ice cream. But what I've really found lovely about building these relationships is I've always believed in being genuinely interested in people.
yeah,
I've not spoken to someone because I can get something out of them. And
yeah,
honestly, this is something I've also learned from you as an elder brother, right? Like, I know we've hung out at the farmhouse with our bros, and I keep a few of them in my memories and pray for them. But it's this ability to build these relationships that has gotten both of us places, and ability to build these relationships with a very, very genuine intent at heart.
yeah.
And I could not be more grateful for the friends and the family I have.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciate about the relationships that I made during the MBA and the higher education part of it is that people are very okay not being in touch and then picking up right where they left off when they do get in touch. So no time is wasted with, oh, you didn't call me for 2 years. It's okay, everybody was busy, everyone's been doing things in their life, but we are here, we're talking right now, so let's pick up from there. And that wasn't really a thing with even my undergrad friends, but in the MBA everyone seems to be much more comfortable with that. So did you feel that about Schwarzman and then MIT as well?
Yeah, no, 100%. I did feel like that, right? Like I meet a few of my friends or speak to them once every 1.5, 2 years, right? But
Yeah,
it's still like where we kind of left it off. And I think Schwartzman especially was very exciting because we all stayed in the same building,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
That kind of relationships that you develop was unparalleled. I think the same thing with MBAs too. And what has really helped in some ways, and I'm glad my wife is not in the room because she would kill me for it. But because I travel so much, I also am in so many different cities that I would
yeah,
at least make sure that I put a dinner with an old friend on my
yeah,
calendar, right? And
yeah,
thank God for incredible executive assistants that I have. They're beyond kind that they would always remind me saying, "Oh, you're in this city. Why don't you go
Yeah.
and meet this friend?" So I try to keep an active list of who is where to
Yeah.
ensure that if I'm hitting that city, I would try to have a meal. But it's like it's exactly where we kind of left it, to your point.
It's one of those things which I think AI and automation will really help you do, is it will remind you that, oh, this is, you haven't spoken to this friend in a year. I actually set aside time every morning just to wish people on their birthdays, because then if nothing, you speak to them once a year. And I've had such great things come out of those little wishes and just sparked a conversation which then got me to some place, or it helped me achieve something I was looking for. And again, like you said, that wasn't the intention of the outreach, but it was a happy byproduct of it. Great. So then, once you got done with Schwartzman, that's when you were with Perfect Day, or was there something else in between?
No, so when I got done with Schwartzman, I actually joined a venture capital fund called Northern Light Venture Capital, which is one of China's biggest investment firms, about $5 billion under management, with about 1.5 to 2 billion dedicated exclusively to healthcare. And my job really when I joined was to figure out investments in India that made sense from our overall fund mandate perspective and fund thesis perspective, which was bridging gaps in healthcare access using innovation, and was also to bring our portfolio companies to China, from China into India as strategic partners and build that up. Unfortunately, that had to take a step back because of the geopolitical tensions between both the
Sure.
countries. So I did that immediately post Schwarzman.
Okay. And how did Perfect Day come about? Because that was a completely different thing compared to what you had done until then, right? Or were there some similarities?
Well, no. So Perfect Day was actually, again, it came through because of a WhatsApp message that a Schwarzman scholar sent, my friend
Yeah.
Mandy Tan. And she was like, I know of this person who went with me to undergrad, and she's looking for someone with a background in science, business, but also understands life sciences, which was such a niche job. And I put my hat into it. I really wanted to be a part of the startup. Like I was an investor for a little time. And I knew that if I wanted to continue being an investor, I wanted to bring in operational expertise. And for that, I really had to get on the ground, get my hands dirty. And so I was looking for a startup which was well funded, but at that growth stage where it was not too big, but also not too small.
Sure.
Perfect Day fell in that category perfectly. And it was a startup that had like India and US connections, which is the corridor I love to operate in. And so that's how Perfect Day really came into the picture.
Okay. For the layperson, can you explain what the main product or service is of the company?
Us, yeah, yeah. So for a layperson, Perfect Day, one part of the business was producing the likes of impossible milk. So we encoded the genetic sequence from the cow, put it into a small fungi, and now that fungi would convert your regular sugar into milk protein, which is casein and whey. So it's lactose free, cholesterol free, tastes just like your regular milk, but also generates 97% lesser greenhouse gas emissions than regular dairy farming. Few people would call it vegan if you consider vegan coming from an animal, but a few people do not because it's still milk protein. But that was the main part of the business. We raised about $750 million from Temasek, CPPIB, New Horizon Ventures. When
Yeah.
I joined, again, I had to continue growing that part of the business and get our approval for India, which
Yeah.
was a very steep kind of learning curve because Indian government had banned anything that was genetically modified. Now, our product was not really genetically modified. And there are specifics of it, but our product was free from any host DNA. So whenever you use a fungi and let's say convert a part of this, if a part of the fungi kind of is a part of the final product, then it's considered GM, right? Like it's considered genetically modified. But in our case, it was just like a big catalyst in between. It took us a little more time, and but in 11 months, I was able to convince the government and the FSSAI that we were a non-genetic company and got our first ever approval for milk protein in India. So I was responsible for that. I was also responsible for building out our plant. So we acquired Sterling Biopharma, which was one of the country's largest biopharma companies from dilution. And they used to make gelatin. So our goal was to also kind of think about making animal free gelatin, make oncology drugs as I stepped in. So Perfect Day had a bunch of verticals. Long story short, one was in the food services sector,
Yeah.
and the second was in the life sciences and pharma sector.
Okay. I'll pretend I understood all of that. But no, that does make sense. And you said that you were still working there while you did the MIT program?
Yeah, so I was with Perfect Day for about 3.5, close to 4 years, out of which the first 1.5 years I was a full time employee with Perfect Day. And then for the remaining 2 years, I moved, switched gears a little bit, and then moved part time because I could not take in the work pressure, etc. But you're right, like I continued doing my MBA at MIT, a full time MBA.
Yeah, that takes a separate amount of grit to do something like it's not just any MBA, it's one of the most prestigious and probably challenging MBAs worldwide. How did you strike that balance? Was it one that consistently came first, or you played it by ear, or what helped you get through that?
And so, if I can be really candid here, there were two things that were driving me, right? I was keen to keep my job and continue working in my job, A, because it
Yeah,
helped me generate a passive income that I could then use to fund my degree.
sure.
B, it allowed me to keep my immigration status. I was on a specialized visa and I wanted to continue being on that visa, which allowed me to work and study. So it was both of those things. Obviously, the MBA did take a priority because I had these wonderful people, surrounded by wonderful people that again come from very, very different backgrounds, but are really inspired to change the world. As one of my friend Nancy joked, I had about 6 to 7% of the entire MIT class at my wedding, right? So I really
Yeah,
wanted to continue building those relationships. And so MBA did take precedence because I also wanted to learn, right? Like there were things that I was really weak in. I was terrible with balance sheets when I first stepped in, and MIT helped me improve that. And there was no other option because, as you rightly pointed out, MIT is one of the toughest MBA programs within the US schools, right? So it's the only M7 school that actually gives out a grade. No other MBA
mm.
program actually gives out a grade. So I had no option, but I enjoyed balancing all of those things.
How was the quality and background of people different versus what you saw at the Schwarzman program?
So I think quality wise, it was pretty good. The reason why I would pick Schwarzman in a heartbeat is I think it was a much smaller cohort, right? Like MIT is still about 400, 450
Yeah.
people. Schwarzman was fully funded with a selection rate of 3% versus MIT, which is about 9%, right? So if I'm really getting to the crux of data, I think in
Mm.
terms of numbers, I think Schwarzman was a different set of people. Plus, a lot of folks in Schwarzman were not really with a business mindset. Like we had musicians in our cohort.
I
We
see.
had doctors like me and my friend Ruby. We had finance professionals. We had people who wanted to do consulting. We had people who were stepping into media. We had journalists. So just the breadth of people that we had was very different. Whereas within the MIT ecosystem, everyone did have a business background, right? And the goal was to take that next leap in career and take that jump or kind of switch your career out. But there was a common thread binding there was it was everyone was in business, very
Yeah,
few people in policy, etc. So that's how the two places were different. But again, both were beautiful in their own ways.
sure. You mentioned one of the decisions for doing both MIT and Perfect Day at the same time was the visa angle. I think a lot of people here, like local everyday Americans, they don't realize how much of a challenge this whole visa thing is and how much stress it causes the average person. I was watching a show by John Oliver, the comedian, and he was talking about the stress that comes with and when you get your green card, it's such a huge relief, and then you feel like your life can now move on. So how much of stress did you face because of that? Obviously it was part of your decisions, but was it stressful, and how did you get around it, and what are you currently on now? Because that's also something unique from what I know.
Well, so again, I love fun facts, right? One other fun fact, if you want to consider how difficult is it to get visas, the average appointment wait times for Indians trying to get a B1, B2 visa
Yeah,
in the COVID/slash pre-COVID times
yeah.
was 800 plus days.
So for more context, B1 B2 is a regular tourist visa. It's not any
Uh,
fancy work. It doesn't allow you to do a job. It doesn't allow you to get any, like, own a business. It's just a visit visa as a tourist or to come to like work meetings. Right? It's not even.
That's correct. Yeah. So I think visa, if you ask me, visa and immigration were the biggest stress factors I've ever had in my life, right? Like
Yeah.
The day my I-140, which is, the green card approval, technically, the green card will still take a decent amount of time,
Yeah.
came through, was the day I remember calling you and crying,
Yeah.
that
I
this
remember.
part of the big stress is, I would think, is over, right? Like, again, I don't know what will happen. I hope only positive things, but
Yeah.
immigration has been such a big part of any decisions that you make in this country. And I really hope it gets easier.
Yeah, losing your job means losing your ability to live in a country. And I always explain it in this way. There are countries like the UAE where it's easy to get a work visa, but you'll never progress to being a permanent resident or a citizen. It's very next to impossible. Then there are countries like Canada where it's harder to get in, but once you're in, there's a straight path to citizenship. You you spend that much time, you're not breaking any rules, you'll get your citizenship. It's pretty certain. So the US is in this weird spot where it's hard to get in and hard to naturalize as well, which is a shame because this country sucks in the best talent of the whole world. The smartest people around the world want to be here, but everything is clouded by this constant one of my friends called it a talwar, like a sword hanging on your head, following you everywhere you go because you just don't know when it'll happen. I think the EB2 green card for Indians, because it's by country of birth, for those who don't know, it's something like 90 years is what the queue is right now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I didn't even bother applying. And so being a Canadian citizen, which I am, doesn't help because it's by country of birth. So yeah, I can relate to it, and I'm glad that temporarily I control my own immigration in the US, and it's been a big source of peace of mind for sure. So on that note, let's take a break here, and then when we come back, we'll talk about what Namit is doing now and what advice he will have for other new immigrants. So we'll be back after these messages. Welcome back. You are listening to Diaspora on KKNW. We are talking to Namit Choksi, who's our guest for today, and we are going to go into a bit more about his visa and immigration journey. Before the break, we were talking about how it is a constant source of stress and how I was able to take some of that stress out because I'm a Canadian citizen, so I have different options available to me. So now my business, therefore, I sponsor my own immigration. So Namit, what steps did you take to relieve some of that stress and have more control over the timing of your stay in the country?
Oh, well, man, it wasn't easy. Let me start by saying that my first petition, so I am in the US on something called as the O1 visa, which is, foreign citizens of extraordinary caliber, also called as the Einstein visa.
Einstein visa. Yeah.
But man, my first petition, I think, was about 1,200 pages, where
Yep.
I had to prove to the US government as to how I was different. There are 10 different categories. You
Yeah.
need to meet these three. I was aiming towards meeting five, but they're really reserved for people who are Nobel laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners, or people who are so specialized. It could be a chef for all, like Vikas Khanna or someone else, right?
Yeah.
But on that visa, so it took a lot of work to work with the lawyers to build that entire narrative and how I was, specialized for Perfect Day, which was my employer at that time.
Mm.
And it kind of worked out as a win-win because Perfect Day was looking for someone like me who had a mix of public policy experience, business experience, but
Yeah.
also understood basic bench science as a result of my postdoc and had worked in the Indian government. So I think for me that the visa journey was difficult at first, and then the other issue with O1 visa is unlike the H1 etc. You can't transfer an employer. Every single time you move to a new employer,
Yeah.
they need to file an entirely new petition saying how you are
Yeah.
different for that job alone. And so, I've had three employers. I still work with Northern Light in a part time capacity. I work with a sleep in, but every employer had to prove time and again as to
Yeah.
how I'm so niche in what I do. In my other two cases, I was a physician with a background in science who also understood investments, etc. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a, it kind of dictated a significant part of my journey, as I would
Yeah.
say. It was difficult, but grateful to be here now.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a similar story of my own where I was working with Amazon. I was on what's an L1 visa, which is an intercorporate transfer, which means Amazon sent me from another country, in this case Canada, to the US. So if I quit Amazon or I get laid off in, these corporate decision making sprees, I can't even go work for somebody else. So I had to first transition to an E2 investor visa before I could start my business, because on that visa I can't be employed by anyone else. But the minute I get the E2, which I would have to go to Toronto for, my L1 would lapse. So therefore I can't be employed by anyone except my own company. So as a result, my visa interview date was my last day at Amazon. And I got asked in the interview that, so what if you don't get this visa? And I said, I genuinely don't know what I'm going to do, because then I have 60 days to leave the country. So it was a really delicate dance. And all of these, I think most Indian people are immigration experts now, because each of these visas has its nuances and has rules whether the dependents can work or not. And it's quite a complex web. That way, Canada's immigration has been very pragmatic. It took 3 weeks to get permanent residency based on their point system, and then citizenship in 3 to 4 years. So I'm just, for the sake of the country and all the innovation that happens here, I really hope that this process is simplified at some point in the future. Because, yes, I 100% agree that illegal immigration is not good. But I think somewhere, even the other end of the spectrum, which is the knowledge workers, or the ones who are providing the Einstein capabilities, kind of get stuck in that same boat with everybody else, and have to go through all these extra hoops. So, and I it never it wasn't the case always. You could get a green card in 3 weeks back in like the 70s and 80s. So
It just changed, man. And I think, I'm really hopeful that the US government really looks into this, right? Like, imagine a lot of my friends are PhDs at a place like Harvard, Stanford, etc. Now, it's already a 3% to 5% selection rate to get there,
yeah,
right? Once you're there, you're on the other side. Now you have to struggle to stay in the country. So,
yeah,
even for someone like me, I have an MD, an MPH, an MPP, and an MBA. And after that, I had to keep proving time and again as
yeah,
to why I deserve this. And again, I mean, they've been beyond kind that they have recognized time and again that, okay, you deserve the visa. But my whole point is there needs to be a better system, right? A more organized system of how this can be kind of done and more streamlined. And I think Canada is a great example of, what they've been able to achieve through this.
yeah. Yeah, for sure. The reason I landed up in Canada is because my L1 was rejected the first time around when I had a subsidiary in the US, and I was moving here to run my own subsidiary and create jobs. So we said, well, I'm kind of bent on going to the back to North America, and so if the US won't have me, then I'll try Canada and they would have me. In a way, when I was living in Canada, I had no longer had the goal of moving back to the States anymore, but circumstances with Amazon were such that it made sense to move back here. So in a way, it was a roundabout 5 years of my life to come back to the US. So once you leave after education, it's really difficult to come back. So totally
Yeah.
get that. At any of these educational institutions where you interacted with all of these people with global profiles, does any one moment stand out for you? A particular interaction or meeting with some dignitary or some leader in their field?
With the grace of Almighty, I've had the chance to meet a lot of really amazing people. But I would say one of my most recent interactions with the Honorable Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, was very, very memorable. And he says something very beautiful a lot of times, and which has stuck with me. He says it in Hindi. He says, "Kuch banne ki aasha mat karo, kuch karne ki aasha rakho,"
Yeah,
which means don't strive to be someone, strive to do something, right?
yeah,
And that has really stuck with me. So I would say that has been one of the most memorable meetings. I've also had the chance to have a conversation, very personal one on one conversation with John Kerry, former US Secretary of State, and had some really lovely conversations about India, the war in the Middle East, and different things, right? Like India, Pakistan, Kashmir, like all of these, wonderful to really understand from a diplomatic perspective what it means to sit in that seat
yeah.
and make those decisions in terms of grant funding, etc. So, yeah, I think a couple of those interactions, obviously, meals with Steve Schwarzman have always been a highlight. And I think one of the biggest lessons Steve has taught me, and I wish my wife was listening at this time, was he said, Namit, one of the most important decisions that you would ever make in life is not the job you take, is not the place you live, it's not the country where you immigrate, but it's who you marry. So think
Yeah.
about it twice. And so that is, yeah, I mean, all of those interactions have stuck with me.
Yeah. What was the context of your meeting with Mr. Modi?
Well, so I recently, through a friend, a mentor, Karthikeya Sharma, who's a member of parliament for Rajya Sabha, became involved with a conclave in India called NXT, which is really next. The conclave talks about what's next, next in space, next in finance, next in money, next in policy and governance. And the conclave is really to bring people to India, right? Like bring the brightest minds from around the world to India for two things. One is to get our folks exposure to all these amazing, incredible people, but also to bring them to India so that a lot of people still think that India is a land of snake charmers. And when they come to India, their eyes are wide open and their
Yeah.
mouths are wide open. And they're like, oh my God, right? And so I got involved with something called as the NXT Conclave, which was then inaugurated by the Honorable Prime Minister, who interacted with a bunch of friends and dignitaries that had gotten on board from around the world. But it's really born from Karthikeya, who is the founder. I'm the co-convener of NXT. So I met him on the grounds of NXT. The conference is at the Bharat Mandapam, or was at the Bharat Mandapam, but we'll continue having editions of it across the world and do it once every year in India, the main
Great.
event.
I had the honor of meeting him when he was the chief minister of Gujarat, and it was a 1 hour interaction in a small group. He already knew all of us by name, he knew what we did, he had context on our businesses. It was phenomenal because he probably meets hundreds of people a day, right? And for him to do that homework, and I particularly remember how precise he was with his answers, how he used data in everything. He didn't spend a minute talking about the whatabouts, because many politicians, you ask them what is happening with this, and they're like, oh, what about that party and what they're doing? Not a single what about, not a single mention of anything outside of his work and what was in his control. So basically, he spoke like a CEO, and I had walked away very impressed. And several members of my family have had the pleasure of meeting him at various points, and what they say is consistent with what I felt and what even you're saying. So that's
Yeah, and I
pretty,
think
yeah,
he is, to your point, he's a CEO, right? He's the CEO of India, of Bharat. And I think one thing that having observed him, I've worked in the ministry for a little while, and I've seen him work, is one of the biggest important lessons that I've learned from him is A, how to pick the right people to run the right ministry, but also how to delegate, right? And then allowing people to lead by just being a resource at the back end, right? This idea of servant leadership to a certain extent. And it's wonderful of how he does that.
yeah.
So, I encourage you to kind of dive a little deeper into it.
He actually, the point you mentioned, he also brought that up on his podcast episode with Lex Friedman, which came out recently. I'll
Yeah.
include a link to that, the show notes. What advice do you have for someone who is interacting or has the opportunity to interact with such people for the first time? I had major imposter syndrome when I was even in London Business School, the initial days, because everybody is such an achiever and yet humble, and they've done so many great things. So when in that setting where you are able to get yourself inserted into such a platform, what advice do you have for how do you interact with those people and what your mindset should be?
Well, I can list out three. First is be genuinely interested in the person you're meeting, right? Like,
Yeah,
think of him as a person, a human being, and not what he or she can bring to you,
yeah,
right? So be genuinely interested and do a thorough background search on the person so you have those common nodes, etc. In my case, when I met the prime minister, I had found a common family friend that he knew since his childhood days, and we spoke about it, right? And so that research helped me, right? And now I know the family friend even better because I passed the message from the prime minister and vice versa. So that the second thing is don't forget who you are. I remember one of the interviewers that I had met in this large panel of Schwarzman,
yeah.
as we were very nervous kind of stepping in, and I'm not going to name him, but he said, you know what? Go inside, relax, and make sure you're yourself.
That's valuable advice. Well, Namit, thanks for that. I think now it's time to do our weekly segment. So let's hear that wheel go around, and that will tell us what we're going to talk about today. This segment is called This or That. So I'm going to give you two options of something that you drink. Pick one, and I'll keep comparing that with something else, and we'll see where you land. So
Nice.
the
Okay.
first one is cappuccino or filter coffee?
Filter coffee.
Filter coffee or perfect days fungi milk?
Filter coffee.
Filter coffee or masala chai?
Filter coffee.
Filter coffee or mango lassi?
Mango lassi.
Mango lassi or thumbs up?
Masala thumbs up.
Masala thumbs up. Oh, that one wasn't there, and I'm going to add it to my list. So I think masala thumbs up, for those who you don't know, is basically thumbs up is India's version of Coca Cola. It's now owned by Coca Cola. And on the streets, you get this concoction which has different spices put into thumbs up, and it tastes out of this world. I don't know if you get this drink anywhere here, but you get like masala sodas. But I think you would
Yeah.
have to go to India for masala thumbs up. So that's great. I think we have time for just one more of these, and I'm going to keep it food centric and not do the click wheel because I know you travel so much. This segment is called Ma Ka Khana, and in this I ask about what is your go-to comfort food, especially when you go home to Bombay. What is that one thing at home or locally that you'll always try to get your hands on every single time you go?
Okay. At home, it has to be saved tomato no shak, which is,
Oh man,
a curry made
uh,
out of
very
tomatoes
very
and
Gujarati choice there.
very Gujarati choice.
I'm gonna
And
include
gold
a
bhakri.
recipe in the show notes.
You must. And a gold bhakri, which is like a sweet, crispy biscuit kind of a bread. When I'm
Oh,
on the streets, I would say bhaji pav, which is
bhaji pav.
fried potatoes with, spices in between pav. Pav is like a very fun Indian
Uh,
bread for all of those
yes.
who don't know. Other fun fact, pav is called pav because they use feet to what do you call it, mellow or mix the dough.
Stop. I didn't know that. That's
You
amazing.
know.
It I think the pav closely resembles like a dinner roll is what you would have here, and it's this white bread, I guess.
But
And
much tastier.
yeah, and a lot of things that are most nostalgic for Indian people, like pav bhaji, vada pav. At least people in Bombay, or they all have pav as a component in there. Awesome. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode and show. Thank you for listening to Diaspora. We hope you enjoyed hearing Namit's very interesting story. Remember to check out our show notes for links and more information about the things we talked about today. You can find Diaspora on all major podcast platforms and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, consider following us on Instagram or leaving us a 5-star review. Diaspora is part of the Staying Power network of shows and podcasts, all of which are dedicated to inspiring listeners to build lives of meaning, connection, and value. You can find the Staying Power network of shows wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back next week with another interesting story from the South Asian diaspora. Until then, take care and stay curious. And Namit, thank you so much for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me.